this whole Russian broadly advertised summer offensive, so-called summer offensive that was supposed to happen this year, basically failing because they're unable to support their troops with their mechanized forces, with their tanks and armored vehicles.
I'm joined today by military analyst and Ukrainian veteran Andrii Kulish, also known as Operator Starsky. Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you so much.
Zelensky announced that Ukraine would be withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention, which banned the use of landmines for those states that signed up. He's doing so under the explanation of anti-personnel mines providing a sort of an invaluable layer of defense for Ukraine, and obviously that being his primary goal as leader of the country. How effective will these landmines be, and what effect will they have on the battlefield?
How effective will they be? Well, I tell you that they're not great for hiking, especially if you're Russian invaders, but they're excellent for crowd control. Again, if we're talking about the Russian tanks and Russian vehicles and Russian invaders. Of course, Ukraine has absolutely legal right to defend its territory from Russian terrorists. I cannot understand any sentiments, towards Russian invaders. The other day, I watched one of my favorite comedians, Louis C.K., who was so mad. Did you see those Ukrainians laughing at those poor Russian invaders dying on their soil, which I completely cannot understand. Of course, we have right to defend our territory, and mines will be a good tool to do that. Currently, Ukraine is probably the most mined territory in the world, but not because Ukrainians mined it. It's because Russians installed thousands and thousands of anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines. They threw and keep throwing their cluster mines from systems like Smerch, Uragan. Those are rockets that basically are like a containers. They open up over a specific territory and spread mines like petal mines, which are extremely dangerous in terms of civil population. Kids pick up those things and they are getting killed or wounded. So Ukraine, as a defensive country, as a country in active defense, has absolute legal rights, not only legal from standpoint of morale. I think we have all rights to defend our land from the Russian terrorists, because they're not fighting on their territory. They're fighting on our territory, attacking us.
So we can get into a little bit more how it might affect the battlefield in a second, because you touched on something I wanted to talk about, which was that Ukraine is already one of the most mined, or the most mined country on the planet. So how was the Ukrainian reaction to the thought of putting in more mines and increasing the percent? I think it's already 20% of Ukraine has got some sort of mine infestation in it already.
Yes, absolutely. But we are talking about the defense against attacking Russian invaders, because Ukraine's main strategy is not just hit, meme, repeat, but also we are in active defense. And of course, we all understand that currently Ukraine is fighting the war of attrition, which means that the captured territory is not as important as the fact that Ukraine will withstand longer than the attacker. That is the main point of this whole war, which looks very much like World War I. And I think the results will be pretty much the same as in the World War I. Also, the territory the Russians are coming from is, of course, controlled by Russians. They have their own lines of defense installed there, including their mines. So even though it's not like nobody can justify the fact that there's plenty of mines on our territory, but on the other hand, it will help us with the defense. Eventually, of course, we will have to clean up everything. I hope that, after the collapse of the Russian regime, the Russians will be very, very eager to help us to clear those territories. I can basically see this happening.
And as a veteran, how do you feel about the use of landmines?
We don't really like landmines in the military unless there are landmines. Okay, back in the days, I remember 2000 since 2014 all the way to 2022. Of course, those landmines that installed both by us and by Russian hybrid army back in those days, it posed enormous danger because if we had some sort of schemes of our own minefields, then the which, by the way, could be lost over time because the Russians were still advancing. They were taking territories despite of Minsk agreements, for example, in the area of Svetlodarsk, Balch, Mironivske, that way, the Baltova. Those schemes of the landmines, minefields, they have tendency to get lost, unfortunately, which is not good. But I know that currently because we are adapting, and Ukrainian armies already improved, I would say, tenfold comparing to what we had in 2020, for example, that will be a much easier task. Anyways, we are talking about the tasks on the level of the general staff. I'm just a humble captain. I know what can happen, like on the level of a company. But speaking of landmines, of course, it's an extremely important tool in terms of the active defense measures, and that's exactly what we're doing.
And so, how would they shape the battlefield in terms of Ukraine's defense? You've mentioned that they're good for crowd control, I think you said.
The very simple explanation is that currently we can see less and less mechanical attacks involving Russian vehicles and tanks because their stockpile is depleting dramatically. And they're sending their basically cannon fodder into those meat assaults that are massive. They use the tactics of smaller groups, which means that they're sending, for example, squad after squad after squad, hoping that at least some of those men will hold the territory and make it possible for others to arrive and to reinforce them. So the landmines will, of course, be much more effective against the personnel. Of course, we have plenty of drones, and currently 99% of the Russian attacks, they're being defeated and stopped at a range of approximately 300 meters from Ukrainian positions, which is a good range. It's effective range of utilizing smaller arms fire. But we are talking about Russian manpower, massive manpower. That is something that Russia has and utilizes, and generally speaking, doesn't care about losses very much. So that will be another very good tool to hold them at a distance.
We've seen some, for lack of a better way of putting it, daring or stupid, there's a thin line between the two sometimes, attacks from Russia, sending men on motorbikes. I think it's been happening for a little over a year now, just directly at the front lines. Would this help to sort of stop some of that sort of activity as well and sort of set those lines in a little harder?
Yeah, because anti-personnel mines, they're also very good against motorbikes, as we could see from the footage. Generally speaking, my mother always told me, don't hang around with bikers because that lifestyle is dangerous. That's exactly what we can see from the footage involving Russian soldiers. So they're very good against bikes as well, against smaller vehicles. Not really good against tanks, but again, we don't see Russian tanks and Russian armored vehicles very much these days. I remember that just a couple of days ago there was some of the rare today they're considered rare mechanized attacks in the area of Chasiv Yar and Pokrovsk. But other than that, for example, even in Sumy, we can see all those columns coming from the territory of Terrorist Federation, bringing, for example, air defense systems, bringing a lot of artillery, of course. bringing different electronic warfare equipment and a massive, massive number of Russian troops. But at the same time, not much of armored vehicles and tanks at all. Which is one of the reasons why we can also see that Ukrainians are pushing the invaders out of Sumy region. They liberated another village yesterday, and we see that this whole Russian broadly advertised summer offensive, so-called summer offensive that was supposed to happen this year, basically failing because they're unable to support their troops with their mechanized forces, with their tanks and armored vehicles.
Do you think it's because they've run out, or they're just simply not as useful support weapons for infantry anymore, given drones and various other innovations, should we say, that have occurred in the last few years?
No, why? I mean, they were sending their vehicles and tanks despite us having drones last year, the year before that. We had javelins. They didn't care much, because who cares about Russian cannon fodder in Russia, right? Let's be honest. But the answer to your question is basically what they're using now: motorbikes. Chinese golf carts, which are even less armored, more vulnerable to Ukrainian drones. That's basically the answer. Why Russians are buying that stuff from Chinese, like golf carts? I don't know. Soon they will be buying like lawnmowers, literally, and using them to deliver their troops because they are literally running out of vehicles and tanks. Some of their storages are actually approximately 80% depleted already. We're talking about the old tanks. We're not even mentioning their T-90 Prorыв or T-72 even, but we are talking about old post-war tanks, T-55, T-62, those old mechanized beasts that come without any advanced electronics, the ones that you could see like, on those black-white pictures of invasion of Prague, Budapest. So those are used massively, and their storages are already almost 80% depleted. And we were talking a lot on my channel, for example, and generally in Ukraine, that year 2026 will be the year when Russia will face very, very critical situation in terms of tanks and in terms of artillery as well.
So moving a little bit onto the sort of the more general changing nature that has been the war in Ukraine. Well, indeed, now the war has shifted more so, I would say, into Russian territory as well, as Ukraine seems to have made this shift towards almost guerrilla-style attacks. Most famous, of course, being the Spider's Web attacks that took out the Russian bombers. We were talking a little bit earlier, the attack that took out 2 more Russian bombers in Marinkova, some Russian helicopters, the big explosion at the artillery missile base in Russia as well. Would you say this is part of a new approach that Ukraine is taking? Sorry.
I would say that it's an evolution. It's an evolution from a strategy that consisted mostly of active defense, and it's a shift from this active defense to oops, your base exploded again. If you face a superior Russian air force like we do, of course you gotta make their planes allergic to open air parking aprons, and this is exactly what we are doing using our drones, using our long range missiles. People who observe this war for several years already, since 2022, they understand that the picture that they see, the picture that they observe, is basically Russia losing capacity. Of course, we know that Russia produces a lot of drones, a lot of cheap drones that they learn to produce from Iranians. They buy stuff from North Korea, of course, because their military industry cannot produce enough weaponry. But we can also see the shift that Russia loses capacity and Ukraine is gaining capacity. Ukraine is building more drones. Ukraine is inventing much more advanced weaponry than Russia. And Ukraine is hitting Russian airplanes, Russian strategic aviation precisely. And this tendency will only continue. We will see Russian capacity shrinking and Ukrainian capacity growing.
We have seen, I think, a shift of Russian tactics into, like you say, using much more easy to produce just drones that aren't even particularly high-tech ones, which can be easily jammed or, I think, shot out of the air with shotguns going quite slowly, but have been in large numbers.
Yeah.
What is the way that Ukraine can defend from this sort of slight shift away from using these slightly more expensive attacks to this sort of just now just throwing machines as well as people into the ground?
I would not say that our machines are more expensive. They're just more sophisticated, probably. The situation is, it looks like this. Russians produce several types of drones over and over again, slightly modifying them, but they scale their production. And of course, they're very, very cheap. I remember that the drones that were coming from Iran, for example, even though they were primitive back then, more primitive than the ones used by Russians today, but they were more expensive back then. Because from what we learned from reverse engineering all those remains of the Russian Shaheds that are being built nowadays, they're even installing cheaper engines on their drones now. Because those engines that were bought, for example, in China by Iranians, they were, though they were simple, right? Though they were cheap, but they were slightly more expensive because they had things like starters. Currently, those engines that they use, they don't even have starters. So they even try to make this production even cheaper, as cheap as possible. Even though, considering that Russia is the most corrupted country in Europe, and Russia is approximately 50 positions more corrupted than Ukraine, according to Transparency Org, I believe that generally speaking, those drones might cost probably either the same or even more than they say, because Shoigu, for example, needs a yacht or a better car. His wife needs like better shoes, things like that. So they don't necessarily cost cheap because they want to make the production cheaper. We know that Russians have other reasons.
And so looking forwards, what sort of things should we expect to be exploding in Russia?
Wish I had a crystal ball to answer this question, because again, I don't work in general staff, but we will see a lot of on a strategic level. We will see a lot of Russian military bases. We will see a lot of strikes on Russian oil storages, ammo storages. Basically, what we did all this time, we were hitting them precisely. I really want to see increased strikes on the Russian personnel, on the Russian territory, places where they concentrate their personnel, where they train their personnel. Maybe we will see that something like that attack that we could see, I believe last year, that happened in Chechnya, the attack on the Kadyrov's Spetsnaz Institute or Spetsnaz University, whatever this place is called. We will see more things like that because, again, at this very point, some of the biggest threats that we're facing, still Russian personnel, a lot of Russian terrorists coming to Ukraine, the Russian manpower itself. And of course, we will see strikes that are conducted by Russian drone operators, and we see also increased number of strikes on Russian drone operators. That is basically the trend of these couple of weeks. We see a lot of footage showing Russian drone operators being eliminated, and those strikes not only involve Ukrainian drones, they also involve HIMARS strikes, bombs, and things like that. That threat is very, very big for us, the Russian drones, of course. And on tactical operational level, I think we will see Ukraine using more robots, more drones, more unmanned vehicles. Recently, Ukraine presented its new robot, which is basically a truck, a wheeled truck, an unmanned vehicle that can travel 700 kilometers or 400 kilometers, carry 700 kilograms of different load, cargo, people, and also the combat modules can be installed on it. And I believe that we will see, specifically in Ukraine's strategy, we will see this shift from using infantry to operations that will not involve infantry at all, probably. We already have such cases. Ukrainian National Guard, Khartia Brigade, that this year, for the first time in history, utilized only drones during the land operation. So we will see more of that sort of things on the Ukrainian battleground.
And just lastly, how regularly should we expect these sorts of attacks? Because I think since Operation Spider's Web, there's been I think at least 5 or so in the last few months.
Well, our higher command warned the Russians that they will face frequent visits very, very soon. Talking about our drones, our missiles. So I think that they should they should prepare. We built many thousands of long-range drones already, and we can already see that those strikes are effective. And again, because we are talking about military, right? It's not like, okay, we have like 1,000 drones, let's just launch them. Because Russians have their strategy of intercepting drones. They have layers of air defense. They have different doctrine of utilizing those layers of air defense. That's why we need to assess as well how to pass through this air defense, how to evade their mobile groups that they're using, and how to strike their targets effectively. And again, this is what we're doing. So probably those strikes will not be massive as we expect, as Russians do, right? Like 2 days ago, 500 drones and missiles just thrown at Ukrainian cities and streets and infrastructure. But we will see much more smart drone warfare, basically the way Ukraine does.